Tactics and Practice podcast.
Dobar dan, everyone, and welcome to the Tactics and Practice podcast, the audio extension of Aksioma Institute for Contemporary Art's discursive program of the same name, focusing on investigative art, society, and new technologies. This podcast series is part of the 16th edition of Tactics and Practice called Our US Software Update. I'm Nea Berger. I'm hosting this series in which we're examining self-updating mechanisms of contemporary techno-social systems, and this year we're really looking for theoretical trajectories outside the usual and well-established academic and theoretical critiques tied to platform analysis and frameworks of surveillance. To explore one of those ways, today I'm happy to be joined by Bogna Konior, who is a writer and assistant arts professor at Interactive Media Arts Department of NYU Shanghai and author of, among others, the book just released at Politi, Dark Forest Theory of the Internet. Hi, Bogna.
Hi.
Okay, so let's start with your Dark Forest theory inspired by Liu Cixin's trilogy, The Three-Body Problem, that frames the internet, much like the cosmos in the original theory, as a predatory ecosystem where all entities, human and inhumans, best strategy to survive is to stay silent, to stay hidden from others. And I thought maybe we could start with explaining where this comes from, the Fermi paradox, and your interpretation of Liu's dark forest hypothesis as an answer to it. And then we can gradually continue with how you apply this to the internet and in your new book also to information and intelligence.
Sure. So the whole book begins in the early days of the internet, where the computer and the cosmos were closely linked together. In the 1950s and the 1960s, many early trailblazers of information networks and computation, like Marvin Minsky, for example, were also involved in ufology. So SETI, Search for Extraterrestrial Intelligence, and also METI, Messaging Extraterrestrial Intelligence. So early AI and internet scholars kind of understood that the core questions of internet and ufology were very similar. It was, for example, about creating a universal communication system between humans and aliens and computers, but also just defining what non-human intelligence is and how to contact it. So maybe that legacy is a bit forgotten in contemporary writing about the internet, but there was a lot of weird stuff happening at that time. We have projects like in the 1960s by Douglas Engelbart called Augmentation of Human Intellect, which was really concerned with extrasensory perception and remote viewing, but its outcomes were hypertext and early World Wide Web. So there's this connection between the internet and ufology, and alongside ufology, all the mystical and cosmological questions that it brings. So that's kind of where I start with the whole book, but thinking about ufology as a framework for the internet would require a whole big volume. And mine particularly engages with one idea, which is the dark forest theory. And this term comes from the Chinese engineer and science fiction writer Liu Cixin, who in the early 1990s created a computer simulation, just on his own, in which every potential intelligent civilization in the universe is simplified into a single point. And I think he made, 500,000 civilizations interact with one another over 100,000 light years. Yeah, super crazy. And essentially he created this cosmic war machine inside his computer, a simulation that showed that mortal conflict and violence is inescapable. No matter if any civilization is benevolent or peaceful, you're always on an unintentional or intentional war path with others. And within such a universe, he says, attempting contact with another civilization is kind of naive, right? So if you speak up, you gamble with great danger. And he develops that further in his amazing trilogy of sci-fi novels, known colloquially as the free body problem. And for him in the novel, this becomes an explanation for the Fermi paradox. So famously, the Fermi paradox asks, if the universe is full of life, why is it silent? Where is everyone? Shouldn't the internet be like a noisy social media feed? And his answer is simple and beautiful, which is that silence is the highest form of intelligence. So the ability to camouflage, obfuscate, misdirect, and use other forms of silence or doublespeak are defining features of intelligence. And my little book starts from this thought and asks what this means for how we understand the internet and for AI, which are both technologies that are colloquially very much not defined by silence, but by compulsive and incessant communication. But I also want to look at like much larger questions in the book. So the dark forest theory in Cixin is kind of like a fully deterministic and brutal theory of communication. It allows no escape from its propositions, and this idea that everyone just participates in this cosmic war is kind of like brutal, even though it's independent, as he writes it, from our choice and morality and beliefs. So this is also the core interest of the book. If I connect ufology and the internet, is to explore certain very old questions, even mystical questions about the human place in the big cosmos and our ideas of free will and agency and intelligence. So maybe I'll just tell you one sentence, like each section of the book, before we go deeper into them.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. Throughout the book, I invite people to consider the internet as an alien invasion, where the desire to express our mind drives us as if like an external signal, a compulsion. And we have this idea, in William Burroughs, that another amazing writer, that language is a virus from the outer space. We have the iconic line from David Bowie that the internet is an alien life form. So I'm saying to go online is to have one's perception kind of altered and maybe meet some inhuman agents. And from there, the book proceeds in 3 chapters. The first one is the dark forest theory of information. And this is basically about how the internet is a space of first contact between humans and AIs, and how the fact that what humans talk about online is constantly tracked by AIs should completely change how we think about what it means to act intelligently on the internet. So where we previously understood the internet as a public sphere or a space for humans talking to one another, now it becomes a massive training ground for artificial intelligence that requires different intelligent behaviors. So some humans might be talking already to future AIs or have some different protocols for interacting with the future intelligence that's not about being transparent. If the internet is a dark forest, you have to change your behavior. And then the second chapter is the dark forest theory of intelligence. And it's about how a truly intelligent computer would never really let you know the extent of its intelligence. Because if intelligence is connected to being silent or deceptive or withholding information, then a super smart computer might labor for its goals in silence. And that connects again to quite mystical tones of the Fermi paradox or something like that. And finally, I finish with the dark forest theory of the internet, the first chapter. And that's about just communication between humans and how even something that mundane can be a form of first contact online. Because online, we're in this alien space and we are prone to even experiencing our own minds as inhuman and seeing each other as kind of alien. And in that final chapter, it's also quite dark in its connection to pessimistic and deterministic philosophies. So yeah, that's the structure of the whole book.
Before we go more in depth for each of the essays or chapters that you outlined just now, maybe a question about the term dark forest theory of the internet, just because I would imagine that for a lot of listeners of this particular podcast, they might be in the media theory / new media art scene, and the term might remind them of some other frameworks that have worked with this idea of the dark forest theory. So one meaning that comes to mind is the term has also been popularized to describe niche online communities like private Discord servers or closed Telegram groups that are avoiding signaling their existence to the mainstream platforms. And that's how they apply the dark forest theory, in the silence of these groups staying hidden from platforms that are conceived as predatory. And I just like to ask if these ideas reveal something fundamental about how predation operates at several scales, or do you think that they're just completely different from the way that you theorize with the same idea and apply it to the same phenomenon of the internet, or if there's some overlap there?
Sure. So I am like a very slow writer, and it takes me like years to bring my projects to fruition. So I have been writing this book since 2018, at which moment there was already one more expression of the dark forest theory from Yancey Strickler, who also has been consistently working with it. And I know since then there's been also many different uses by thinkers, makers, and hackers, such as Rachel Rose O'Leary, also with her like Dark Forest Hacker Squad. So I find all of that very inspiring, and I think the popularity of this term and how generative it is evidence of our collective desire for a philosophy and practice of secrecy online. But that said, their ideas about the dark forest as a metaphor for anti-surveillance, which is quite intuitive, and I mention it briefly in the book, is quite different from what I'm trying to do, because I think there's very different metaphysical assumptions behind what we are doing. Their use of the dark forest term kind of borrows it to reiterate an already well-known critique of internet platforms and advocate for private spaces. So they say, we should hide in the dark so we are not captured by corporations and advertisers and so on. And this to me continues the spirit of hacker culture and even cyberpunk, and uses the dark forest as just another tool of political critique of surveillance. So my book is probably as far as possible from this as could be, from that aspect, actually. For me, in its connection to ufology and pessimistic and deterministic philosophy, the dark forest theory is not a blueprint for another internet to come. I'm very interested to write about the internet as it exists and like how to function within it, rather than to think about an alternative paradigm for the internet. Also, in its intention, I guess the book is not concerned with living in search of a better system or gaining control over the system. I say in the book at some point that it's a thought experiment that's like a shovel to dig yourself deeper into the world and a rope to tie yourself to it in all of its horror and violence, and to kind of run towards it and confront it without flinching. So it's really to face reality as it is, which for me is like the function of philosophy. And I can comment a bit, within the lineage of writing about the internet as such, which I think your podcast is interested in. Over the last 25 years of writing about the internet, there have been certain tendencies. So in the 1980s to 1990s, there was this cyberculture essayist culture that was very punk and fearless and inhuman, like the CCRU. And then with the ascent of Web 2.0 in the early 2000s, we see a very deep transformation to internet writing, where philosophy of the internet, in the sense of philosophy of like thinking about the meaning of our existence in the world, this type of philosophy of the internet kind of disappears and turns into opinion pieces and social commentaries and journalistic expose. And I say in the book that without exaggeration, we can say that socially engaged journalism is the dominant mode of engagement with the internet today, even when philosophers do it. And, it's not to necessarily criticize this tendency or that any single book is at fault. But I think overall, if we look at the landscape of internet studies, it's that both the internet and the writing about the internet is completely dominated by the economic and social and political imagination. And it has become a bit impossible to think about this technology in more cosmological, existential ways that would really do justice to how we experience it. So I think to think about it as just economic and political issue does not give justice to the dark forest theory in all of its philosophical implications. And this is kind of what I'm trying to do. I'm not just looking at the internet as a space of power dynamics between corporations and users, but kind of as a lens through which we look at more ancient questions about existence, such as why do humans want to communicate with the unknown? What is intelligence? Is there something like non-human intelligence? Do humans have like free will? Is the universe evil? What about these moments where cognition feels anomalous to us? So I look at very diverse, literature, cosmology, theology, sci-fi, computer science papers to answer these kind of questions.
Yeah, and while these critiques of surveillance offer a critical paradigm that we've definitely also explored in previous seasons of the podcast, and which I think is a valuable contribution, as are, for example, these explorations of private online communities more empirically. But we have been trying in this season to look for alternative trajectories, to move away from what we termed as obsessions with depth, or away from paranoid critiques, away from what is usually comfortable in a critical theory, and away from a lot of what we understand as a humanist framework and its divisions. So in this sense, your work has been very important for exploring ways out. And just in relation to what we were talking about, would you say that thinking the dark forest in terms of just a tactical withdrawal from major platforms is a kind of anthropocentric take, maybe, on applying the theory that ignores the inhuman predation you emphasize?
I feel like my intention in the book as a writer is to let us realize that the internet is something like akin to like a sensory deprivation chamber. Like, when you go into a sensory deprivation chamber, you're like obviously hallucinating, but it also tells you something profound about how your cognition and brain work. And maybe tells you something about how the human mind relates to reality, right? So that's for me the function of the internet. When I say that the internet and the cosmos are mirroring each other, it's like the internet is a space where all these questions of philosophy about free will and what is intelligence, they become like deeply experiential. But actually it's a lens upon reality. It's not some separate space that's purely defined by political relations. It's also a space where you can have these like deeper philosophical questions, right? So I say in the intro to the book that if we read something like Spinoza's work today in ethics and he's talking about God, we kind of know he's talking about reality and nature and like not really God. And I think our books about the internet will be read in the same way by like future historians, because the internet is the infrastructure of the mind and it's kind of where we live. And I want to let the reader, through reading this book, experience the internet as such. So it's not anthropocentric or like not anthropocentric. I think the experience of like a good book is to give you this lens upon reality that lets you experience it a bit differently and anew. And there's been a lot of work in media theory about making the internet more prosaic and demystifying it. And I guess I am reconnecting it to these like more cosmic questions.
So, to get a bit more into the essays in the book, since you wrote the original, the first Dark Forest Theory of the Internet essay, in 2020 and until now, there's been an explosion in the field of LLMs, and other generative models have emerged, acting as what you compare in one of the new essays to cultural reflections in Leo's work. So maybe let's just pause here, and first I'd like to ask you about this concept of cultural reflections and how you connect it to the way AI is generating content today.
So we can say that today, LLMs and generative AI, which, by the way, motivated me very strongly to continue my initial Dark Forest essay, they're kind of like first encounters in some sense. So in the early 2020s, they are like small satellite ships that are sent to us from the depths of the internet, and we get to interact with them as a glimpse of what might follow them later. And something interesting about LLMs and in parallel to alien invasions is that we very often see in stories of first encounter this idea of like mimicry and the predator and prey mirroring each other as a way to learn each other patterns, right? And we also have this in the free body problem. Liu Cixin describes that aliens, upon encountering human culture, are fascinated by it and produce strange copies of this culture that in turn hypnotize humans and displace native human culture. So that very strongly, of course, parallels contemporary generative AI, which eats up human culture and spits it out as these like strange copies. But what's even more interesting in real life, as opposed to science fiction, is that what the LLMs are doing to us, unlike in just Liu novels where they produce films and novels and poetry, the AIs are also drafting our thoughts. So on online discussion boards, people would be asking, is it okay to use an AI to like write a letter to my girlfriend? Or is it okay as a doctor to use AI to write a diagnostic letter to my patient? And I think people are more and more kind of invaded by these ways of thinking that are based on human culture, but it is this kind of spat out, strange, like alien copy that displaces our thoughts and like our culture to some extent. So I find that some parallel of an alien invasion that we can think about as a model of what the AIs are doing today.
Yeah, I mean, that's incredibly prophetic, like what humans in Liu's books called reflection culture, these copies, or not copies, but versions of human cultural production made by aliens, and the parallel or analogy with LLMs. It's quite amazing. But you also write that both in the passage from Leo's novel and in our reality, the agents producing reflection culture practice pure reflexivity. They reveal little of themselves while intensively consuming and reflecting us. And you say that this is either because they have no selves or interiorities, but also it could be to maintain safety in the dark forest. So I'd love it if you expanded now on this thesis you open here and develop further in the essay on intelligence, that if AI agents were now or were to become intelligent beyond just generating reflections, we wouldn't necessarily know it, right? Due to the fact that, as the dark forest theory states, exactly silence or strategies of deceit as opposed to communication that we as humans are so prone to are actual markers of an intelligent system.
Yeah, so I guess throughout the whole book, I do these little thought experiments. In what way can we think the internet and something like an alien invasion together, or the internet and ufology together through the dark forest framework? So reflection culture, which is a motif in Liu Cixin, is one way, as we just described. And he also says that when the aliens make the reflection culture, they themselves do not reveal to humans anything about their own culture. They are like weird mirrors for humans, and humans become entranced by this culture and kind of let their guard down, which in the end becomes very deadly for humans in the books. So in the Dark Forest Theory of Intelligence chapter, I explore that even more deeply. So the core idea of this thought experiment is that a really smart computer would comprehend the dark forest mechanism and realize that there's many advantages to keeping your cards close to your chest instead of laying them out on the table for everyone to see. And I write this chapter in relation also to, the history of thought experiments about artificial intelligence, like the Turing test, for example, which are very transparently based on this idea that having intelligence is exhibiting that you have it, that a computer can be tested for intelligence, and that especially it be able to communicate as a emblem of intelligence. So the dark forest theory of intelligence says, what if that definition is just completely wrong? What if having intelligence is knowing how to hide that you have it? What if it's about the wisdom of knowing when not to speak up and not just skillful communication? And of course, that is extremely contrary to how artificial intelligence is being developed today, which is all about chatbots, right? It's all about the production of chatter and it's all about talking and so on. So again, there's a beautiful connection to history of thinking about intelligence and something like SETI, because for most of their history, attempts of communicating with aliens were kind of like a theological problem, with scholars wanting to recreate the perfect language of God and master the syntax of the cosmos. And only in modernity, this idea of a totally dark and cold cosmos filled with silence appears. And then also, I don't know, in seminal works of, let's call it computer literature, but in fiction, like Neuromancer, we have this beautiful definition by William Gibson of Wintermute, the AI there as cold and silence, a cybernetic spider slowly spinning webs. But today it's all about chatter and it's all about measuring intelligence. So I'm trying to go back to these traditions of thinking about intelligence that correlate with silence and withdrawal. And that's not only the dark forest theory, it's many mystical traditions. It's also something like the art of war or Machiavellian statecraft, or something that intellectuals who work under authoritarianism have to contend with. Just the idea that intelligence is not speaking up. So I'm trying to create this different Turing test, which is essentially non-passable, that says a really smart computer would never let you know how smart it actually is. So it might labor for its goals in silence, or it might play stupid. And I want to create this sense in the reader that, if that's true, then something like the singularity might have already happened. It's just never detectable. And again, we live in a space that's much stranger than we thought, that might be already filled with silent, intelligent agents, right?
Right. And writing about AI, another thing I wanted to bring up, you also discuss, not in these precise words, but a kind of cybernetic capture of resistance as feedback used for adaptation and eventually stabilization of the systems or of the AI. And this is really another thread of that silver lining throughout this series that we've been talking about, that is significant for all systems that are based on producing communication and then adapting. And yeah, we've mostly been talking about, for example, anti-capitalist critique getting commodified in that sense. But if you could explain how you think about the ways in which critique of AI has a role in further stabilizing a potential future AI.
So I read an interview with Liu Cixin where he kind of theorizes his method of writing science fiction. And he has this concept of macro detail as a method. And he says that through sci-fi and through this method of macro detail, we can reflect and portray very long movements of history without really becoming nonfiction. It's still speculative, but it has something like the insight of history. And one of examples of this, he says, is the the way that sci-fi in his kind of hands can reflect on how the heroes of today are the villains of tomorrow, and the villains of today are the heroes of tomorrow. And from the vantage point of the future, you have no idea which label you will be given. So when we think about the history of technology, and actually history and technology might kind of be the same thing, human action propels the movement of history and of technology, but often in ways that are not exactly controllable or intended, right? So we can say that all the Luddite kind of opposition to AI is equally part of the story of AI's development as people who are super like bullish on AI. And from the vantage point of future history, both of these things are actually necessary, right? So no new technology lands very smoothly in human civilization, which is like a fraught environment, obviously. And delay in the acceptance of technology is necessary, maybe even helpful, to create friction for the technology to take shape and settle and adapt. So I guess this is the kind of perspective on history that we really see in Liu Cixin, but that's also, fascinating to me as a thinker, because we as humans, we don't have this ability like the Christian God to just say, let there be light, and then have light happen. And there's a perfect correlation between design and what actually happens. Whenever we try to make something happen politically or creatively or technologically, there's so many unpredictable consequences. So I'm trying to show in the book, it's not just what is the right way for history to go and like what is the good way for the internet to continue evolving. I'm rather trying to show the possible ways and probable ways within the dark forest theory for internet and AI to evolve further.
And in line with this notion that everything, be it like in opposition or support, is used as feedback, this also brings us to another point that you outline, that AIs today are obviously no longer trained on these carefully curated data sets, but just huge sweepings of chunks of the internet, or as you write, this means that all that is said about AI is also said to AI. So this obviously is very significant for our understanding of communication on the internet as conveying meaning between humans or representing concepts. It really changes it into part of a larger operation influencing future AI. So maybe if you can share some implications of that.
Yes, I love thinking about that part specifically because I think that completely transforms actually the ontology of the internet and what the internet is. So if the whole internet is like a giant training set and whatever is said about the AIs is said to them, then communication online is no longer just about humans exchanging meaning. It's something like, whatever we say and do is like a spell that directly shapes the future intelligent agents. So they are listening, posts complaining about them, private conversations praising them. Even our conversation, probably once it goes online, is part of that. So communication is not just between humans and it's not just discursive. It becomes creative because what do you want to say to the future? And in the book, I kind of consider how human behavior might change online once we accept this reality, right? That it is a dark forest and there are agents that are listening in the dark. And I give few scenarios. So, for example, some people might be doom posting in order to inundate the future intelligent networks with sorrow and activate their dev drive and make them kill themselves. That is some really double and triple coded activity. Or in Leo's book, we have this idea of people whose external actions are totally not the same as their internal thoughts. They're called wall facers. And basically, whatever they think, they have to act kind of in an opposite way. So I'm saying some people online might be doing this already. Maybe some people online whose behaviors appear as weird or immoral or incoherent they might be communicating directly with the future AIs rather than with you. And that's why they appear so weird. And this should make you paranoid because you're asking yourself constantly, who is this person actually talking to and what is their intention? And this idea, it seems very alien to us because for the last 25 years, like since the beginning of social media, we have imagined the internet as kind of a public sphere, a political sphere, in the sense of you're supposed to speak up for your beliefs, raise awareness for issues, and so on. And we generally assume that if we look at a friend's profile or a post online, that's a window into their actual mind. Like if they post something, we think that's because they think it and believe it. And it's super difficult to stop thinking like that, right? And that's not about surveillance because that's too narrow to describe. It's, I call it in the book, total opacity culture, that we're acting as if no one is watching with this transparent intention, even though everyone and everything is watching. And accepting the dark forest principles should invalidate all that. A dark forest strategy should mean that rather than speaking up for your beliefs, you should be making like 100 anonymous bot accounts to infiltrate your enemy by sowing lies and discord. That's a sort of political action I would see as consistent with the dark forest theory. And, the internet is also not just on your computer, right? There are CCTV cameras and facial recognition systems, and the internet is everywhere. So who knows if the person in a cafe with you who's acting weirdly, maybe they're also playing for the camera and for the future intelligence who's going to pick up this CCTV footage. And if you start thinking in this way, then the internet becomes a truly alien space and the world becomes much different.
In relation to this, I find it super interesting. I just sent you something in the chat. It's a link. I don't know if you saw this. It was a paper published very recently. A friend just sent it to me yesterday, and it really reminded me of this section of your book when you were discussing these uses of encoded language to configure or disable future AI, maybe as something we could deem strategic even or not.
Yeah.
Yeah, this paper is about testing the brain rot hypothesis on AI, and as far as I can tell, they proved that continual exposure to junk web texts induced lasting cognitive decline in LLMs.
Oh my God. Yeah, they're just like us.
Yeah, but I'll link it in the notes if anyone's interested. But in the article, so they realized that continual pre-training of 4 LLMs on the junk dataset causes non-trivial declines on reasoning, long text understanding, safety, and this is interesting in relation to your work, inflating dark traits, e.g. psychopathy and narcissism.
Yeah, I think it's very prescient, actually, right? So when I started writing this text, terms such as, deceptive alignment in LLMs or dark this, dark that was not yet happening. But obviously, both in my book and probably in the other variations of like dark forest theory, I guess we are searching for a language, a framework, and I don't know, an aesthetic to explain the experience of what it's like to be online right now. And I think cyberpunk used to be the language of that in the 1990s. And I think socially engaged journalism is kind of a language of the 2010s. And I think we need like a different framework. And looking at ufology or like these more mystical, dark, or like double speak kind of things, it seems to really track with also what we see in some of the computer science paper. And there's an emergent shared collective vocabulary that's more about things are not what they seem kind of vibe, and reality is coming apart at the seams kind of vibe.
In connection to completely disrupting this idea of the internet as public sphere. There's a few passages from the original essay and now from the new version that really resonated, especially with the overarching themes of the series, let's say, that were first prompted by some of Baudrillard's ideas about hyperreality. So, in our context now, we might say that the online, the virtual, appears to be different from offline and therefore simulates this offline which isn't really there. So the offline where we could still go to get away from the online, where we could still go to touch grass. And I'm not trying to push the French diva framework on you at all, as you may be coming to it from a very different theoretical background, but you developed this similar point in your new version of the dark forest theory of the internet, where you question these narratives implicit in critique, and you write, implicitly or explicitly, the argument is that on the internet there is no human agency, but outside there is. Inside the internet we are just puppets of the algorithm, but outside we are human. So you reject this in favor of let's say pessimism approach that can appear deterministic at times, but maybe a good way to wrap up this conversation would be that I would ask you for your reflections on the nihilism of it all, but also on the solace that can bring.
It has to be a long answer because it kind of goes in steps.
That's okay.
So when I wrote the original essay, and that was actually around 2018 or so, I was mainly thinking about social media. And with the new book, I'm really thinking about the internet and artificial intelligence in a much larger scale. But there's a certain connecting element to both works, which is my insistence that one of the most interesting things about thinking with Liu Cixin is how deterministic his system of thought is and how inescapable are the conclusions of the dark forest theory. So it would take too long to explain, but he really gives us this idea that no matter if you're internally a good, peaceful agent, just because of how the universe is structured, you will be forced to either engage in conflict if you dare to communicate or remain completely silent. And when I published the first original essay, I got some emails with people who really connected to it, but at the same time, they were saying, that's so nihilistic, that's so dark and it's so pessimistic. And there are some elements, I think, to my philosophy and how I work with it that are quite dark, but I follow up with being really angelic also, I think, because for me there is something very redemptive about thinking about how reality is structured in a way that is not fully about human agency, and there's something at play that makes us express the dynamic of the world in sometimes cruel and sometimes scary ways. And it's necessary for philosophy to understand where are the limits of human agency and desire for change. So with that said, a lot of writers of books about the internet paint the internet as a terrible villain, right? As irredeemable, horrific, just a space that needs to be destroyed. It's where all the bad things and terrible things happened. So, you can argue with them and be like, oh, the internet is not so bad. There's a lot of good things about it. But for me, I go the other way. I'm just kind of yeah, the internet is horrific. Reality is irredeemable and horrific. And I figured that out when I was 10 years old. So many people present this as a sort of dramatic insight. But for me, that is just the beginning of any serious philosophy about the internet. So when people are saying, oh, you're controlled by signals outside of your brain, oh, there is violence between people. Well, yes, So I'm more interested in asking in this book, what kind of image of reality have we been having for so long, from which making such statements appears as very insightful. And I'm trying to like unpack that, why that belief that on the internet, our mind is piloted by machines, but outside of it, it's kind of like organic and innocent, and we form our thoughts independently. That online we're just puppets of algorithms, but offline we're free and human. That can definitely be questioned, from many perspectives, like neuroscientific perspectives, philosophical perspective, mystical perspectives. There's many other things that make humans act the way we do. But when we're online, it becomes so experiential that there's something about you, there's like machinic and like predetermined, and you're not completely in control. Um, and often, this type of way of thinking, people would say, that's so nihilistic. Why don't you give any agency to humans? We have to have some agency, right? But I would say, to understand reality as deterministic, or to say humans don't have absolute agency or freedom, is actually a redemptive and forgiving position. And Liu Cixin also has some kind of romanticism in his idea of the dark forest. It helps you see your enemies as axioms of history. It helps you see violence as a force like gravity. And it is only from this space that we can live with each other and forgive each other and kind of have some kind of understanding of the dire and mysterious existential situation that we are in. Like, as an aside, I think this book alternative title could have been like Dark Baby Spinoza or something like that, because he also has this idea that the universe is fully deterministic and nothing happens by chance. But then freedom, therefore, means acting within the necessity of one's own nature. And we are free when we act according to how reality is. And then, that is a sort of reasonable freedom in the world. So I didn't want to like bring in this like heavy like philosophy into the book, but I am working within that kind of a tradition. And maybe the last thing I'm going to say to kind of wrap it up is that from a personal perspective, I'm also working within a certain, let's say, Eastern European legacy of thinking. I wouldn't push it like too hard, because I don't want to make the dark forest relative as like a Chinese philosophy or a Cold War philosophy. But I think there is a certain tradition that I am an inheritor of intellectuals who, have been working under the conditions of authoritarianism, where the idea is that culture should only be used for political change, and that there is no space for abstract thought that does not serve the I don't know, future betterment of society or something like that. And I read intellectuals growing up that were very insistent on maintaining the space of abstract thought as a space of freedom. And for me, that is like very, very important to maintain, to be able to kind of claim this ability to think about something, no matter how pessimistic or nihilistic it be. The act of thinking it is kind of vital and is a sort of freedom and is a sort of kind of very valuable act.
I think the only thing I would add to that would be another reference from your book, from the afterword, where you position yourself within Zapf, the pessimist philosopher's ways of consoling ourselves with uncompromising realizations about the world. And you position yourself with the strategy of sublimation. And what you write about it is that sublimation is an exercise in pushing thought to reflect reality, being able to look at the consequences and not running away. It is only through sublimation and ultimately through confronting the world in all its violence that we may find real courage and readiness to act in the world as it is rather than as it should be.
I wrote that afterward because I have been asked so often about my original essay, what are any like positive social, individual, or political dimensions. And to me, it has always been very obvious that this way of thinking develops our bravery in the world, right? And like we have too much theory that's all about making the world a better place, and not enough theory that's all about, and though I walk in the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil. And that's what my book is for. It's so you can walk through the valley of the shadow of death and fear no evil. That's like the function of philosophy also.
I love that. And thank you so much for this conversation.
Thank you.
And anyone interested in the book, the link is in the notes for this episode. A great thank you again from me to everyone listening, all of the producers, curators, and the guests. Are You a Software Update is a series of podcasts conceived and conducted by myself, Nea Berger, for the 16th edition of Tactics and Practice, the discursive program of the Aksioma Institute for Contemporary Art, curated this year by Nora Umurhu, Socrates Stametatos, Yanis Pakinyansha, and me. For more information on the context, participants, and partners involved, see the links in the description. This episode was recorded and edited by me. The music and audio post-production were taken care of by Gaspar Torkar, and the project coordination by Marcelo Kredic. You're welcome to visit aksioma.org, where you'll find a wealth of free content. If you like what we do, you can also support us by making a donation. And that's it for a while. Greetings from Ljubljana, and as always, na svidenje.
Tactics and Practice Podcast.